Long before the streaming platforms began fighting over subscriber numbers, long before superhero franchises colonized every multiplex on the planet, and long before the internet gave every devoted fan community a place to gather and grow into something unstoppable, there was a single television program that looked up at the night sky and decided that what it saw up there was worth exploring. It arrived on September the 8th, 1966. Without fanfare and without particularly impressive numbers. The audience it drew was modest. The money it had to work with was, by any honest accounting, embarrassing. And yet Star Trek. The original series went on to become something that the entertainment industry had never quite produced before and has struggled to replicate ever since. A piece of science fiction so fundamentally ideas-driven, so genuinely visionary, that it reshaped not just a genre but the imaginations of the engineers, scientists, and storytellers who encountered it while growing up. Behind the shimmering transporter effects and the elegantly raised Vulcan hand salutes, however, there is a backstage story full of accidents, compromises, near disasters, and decisions that could easily have gone the other way. Here are 20 strange and largely untold facts about the original Star Trek that will change the way you watch it. The story of Star Trek begins not with the captain everyone knows but with the captain nobody remembers. When Gene Roddenberry first sat down to sell his idea to NBC, William Shatner was nowhere in the picture. The network had already committed its enthusiasm to someone else entirely. Jeffrey Hunter, a genuine Hollywood name who had recently portrayed Jesus Christ in the biblical epic King of Kings, and who brought with him a weight and gravitas that Roddenberry found genuinely compelling. Hunter shot the original pilot episode in the role of Captain Christopher Pike. The character he played was serious and introspective and burdened in a way that felt philosophically rich. Everything the show's creator had been reaching for. Then, without warning or clear explanation, Hunter walked away. Counts vary. Some suggest his wife, who was also his manager, steered him away from a television commitment she considered beneath his standing as a film actor. Others suggest the decision was his own, rooted in a feeling that the project didn't quite deserve his investment of time. Whatever the actual reason, the role was suddenly and completely open. William Shatner stepped into it and immediately made it his own in ways that nobody had predicted and that cannot quite be explained in purely rational terms. Where Hunter had been measured, Shatner was expansive. Where Pike had been brooding, Kirk was magnetic and occasionally excessive and thrillingly alive. The show's entire emotional temperature changed the moment he walked onto the bridge. The tragedy attached to all of this is quietly devastating. Jeffrey Hunter died in 1969. Just 3 years after the show premiered, at only 42 years old, without ever having lived long enough to witness the cultural colossus that his departed role eventually became. And while Kirk's absence from the original vision is startling enough, it raises an equally interesting question about the character who many would argue defined the series even more completely than its captain. The Spock that the world came to know and love almost arrived looking completely unrecognizable. Roddenberry's earliest written concept notes, the ones that existed before the show had a network or a budget or a cast, described Spock as a figure with reddish skin. A coloring that leaned deliberately into something unsettling, something demonic and alien in the most genuinely disquieting sense of the word. The early sketches that accompanied these notes pushed hard in the same direction, depicting a character who looked less like a sympathetic figure and more like something from a nightmare. Roddenberry wanted otherness, and he wanted it to be immediately and viscerally visible. What stopped all of that from happening was not a creative change of heart but a technical reality nobody could argue with. The majority of American households in 1966 were still watching television on black and white sets. Red skin, filtered through monochrome broadcast technology, would not read as exotic or alien. It would read as dark. The implications of that visual in the racially charged America of the mid-1960s were not something anyone on the production wanted to navigate. The solution they settled on was a greenish-yellow tint, present enough to signal something non-human, understated enough to avoid causing problems on the screens that actually existed in people's living rooms. The irony that arrived once the show began broadcasting in color was complete and somewhat comic. The tint was so delicate that the majority of viewers who were watching in color barely registered it at all. The ears, however, the pointed, unmistakable, quietly extraordinary ears, turned out to carry more than enough of the weight on their own. Poll any group of dedicated Star Trek fans about which piece of the show's imagined technology they find most captivating, and the transporter will feature prominently in the responses. The concept it represents is genuinely staggering when you give it a moment's honest thought. The complete disassembly of a living human being at the molecular level, the transmission of that information across space, and the precise reassembly of that person at a destination, intact, conscious, and continuous with who they were before. It is one of the boldest single ideas in the entire history of science fiction. It is also, and this is where the story gets considerably more grounding, an idea that was born not from creative ambition but from a budget that had simply run out of room. The original production plan had the Enterprise crew traveling to planetary surfaces the way anyone watching in 1966 would have expected. Aboard shuttlecraft, with a camera following the descent, the approach, the landing. It would have looked remarkable. It would also have required money that did not exist. The production team needed a solution that was achievable within their actual financial constraints, and they needed it quickly. What they devised was the transporter effect, achieved by filming glittering particles of dust against a dark background, then running that footage in reverse. The total expenditure involved was a small fraction of what a shuttle sequence would have cost. A desperate practical workaround became one of the most debated concepts in contemporary physics, one that university researchers have cited as an inspiration for experiments in quantum teleportation. The production team that couldn't afford to build a shuttlecraft inadvertently gave science something worth thinking about for the next 60 years. The standard arrangement between a television production and a network involves one opportunity to make a first impression. Star Trek received something that almost never happens in the industry: a second chance. The condition attached to that second chance, however, was the network's clear and unsparing verdict that the first attempt had been fundamentally misconceived. The original pilot, an episode called The Cage, was delivered to NBC in 1965. The response from the network was direct and not particularly kind. Too cerebral, they said. Too slow in its pacing. Insufficiently action-oriented. And the female first officer, a character called Number One, played by Majel Barrett, was, according to the executives reviewing the footage, simply too much for the viewing audience of that era to accept in that kind of authority. NBC turned the pilot down without ambiguity. But they also did something genuinely unusual. They offered Roddenberry the resources to try again. He went back and rebuilt. Number One was written out. Kirk, Spock, and a considerably more kinetic storytelling approach were written in. The footage from The Cage did not disappear, however. Roddenberry folded it into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which became the only Star Trek episode ever to win a Hugo Award. The thing the network had rejected as fundamentally wrong became, in a different shape, formally recognized as among the best science fiction of its time. What Nichelle Nichols was doing simply by reporting to work on the set of Star Trek was, in the context of American television in the 1960s, an act that carried genuine cultural weight whether she chose to think of it that way or not. As Lieutenant Uhura, she occupied a position on screen that had essentially no precedent in mainstream American broadcasting. A black woman in a role defined by expertise, authority, and professional dignity, treated by the narrative as fully equal to her colleagues in every respect that mattered. After the first season concluded, she made the decision to leave. Broadway had made her an offer, and the pull of the stage was real and strong. She submitted her letter of resignation to Roddenberry. Before anything could be finalized, she attended a fundraising event organized by the NAACP, and there she was told that someone wanted to speak with her. That someone was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What he said to her in that conversation shifted everything. He told her that Uhura was not simply a character in a television program. She was evidence, visible proof on a mainstream national platform, that black women belonged at the highest levels of human endeavor. He told her that children who looked like her were watching and seeing, for what might have been the first time, someone who looked like them in a position of genuine professional consequence. She withdrew her resignation the following day. The conversation, she said for the rest of her life, was among the most significant she ever had. The pairing of Leonard Nimoy and Spock is so complete in the cultural imagination that it has become almost impossible to think of either one without immediately thinking of the other. In the months before the show began production, however, Nimoy was genuinely and seriously unsure that any of it was a good idea. His anxiety centered first on the physical, the ears above all, combined with the unusual skin tone and the severe facial architecture the makeup department was designing. He worried that the overall effect would read as monstrous rather than sympathetic, that audiences would see a creature rather than a character, and that the role would damage rather than advance a career he had spent years building through serious, trained theatrical work. He also worried about typecasting in its most limiting form, that he would become permanently associated with a rubber-eared novelty and find himself unable to escape it. The emotional demands of the role presented a separate and equally serious challenge. Nimoy had been trained in expressive, emotionally available performance. Spock required the precise opposite, a complete and disciplined suppression of every outward sign of inner feeling, a performance built around absence and control rather than expression and release. Rewiring instincts that deeply embedded takes real work. What resolved his uncertainty was not a conversation with a producer or a reassurance from Roddenberry, but the response of the audience itself. Viewers looked at Spock and did not see a monster. They saw something underneath the logic and the stillness, something that felt, paradoxically, more human for being so carefully withheld. Nimoy wrote about his relationship with the character across 2 separate autobiographies published years apart. The first was titled I Am Not Spock. The second was titled I Am Spock. Everything that happened between those 2 titles is its own kind of story. On the 22nd of November 1968, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura kissed on screen during an episode of Star Trek. It was a moment that has since been cited repeatedly as one of the first, and by some accounts the first, interracial kiss in the history of American primetime network television. What is less frequently discussed is how close that moment came to never existing at all, and the lengths the network went to in order to try to prevent it. NBC's position was clear and explicit. The scene needed to be restructured so that the kiss was not a choice made by the characters themselves but something imposed on them from outside, specifically by telekinetic alien compulsion. The reasoning behind this was equally explicit. Framing it as involuntary gave the network's Southern broadcast affiliates political cover to keep the episode on the air. It wasn't a real kiss. It was alien mind control. Nobody was endorsing anything. William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols responded to this instruction by doing something quietly brilliant. During the takes in which they were required to keep their heads apart, to perform the version the network wanted, they subtly and consistently ruined the footage, flubbing the takes in ways that were small enough to be plausibly accidental but consistent enough to be unusable. The only clean footage available to the director was the footage in which they turned toward each other. The network received what it had asked for in the script. The actors delivered what they had decided to deliver on the day. Nichols later shared the detail of a letter that reached her afterward, written by a white man from the American South, who described the moment as something that had genuinely unsettled his settled convictions and made him reconsider things he had never previously questioned. A single moment of television. An entire man's belief system rattled open. Star Trek's relationship with its audience was, from the very beginning, something different in kind from the ordinary connection between a program and the people who watched it. It was not a show that happened to have fans. It was a show whose fans, on 2 separate occasions, intervened in its fate and changed the outcome. After the first season, NBC began floating the possibility of cancellation. After the second, the floating became something more serious and more public. What the network had not fully reckoned with was the nature of the audience it had spent 2 seasons cultivating. The response that followed had no real model in television history. Fans wrote letters in numbers that, by the most reliable estimates, reached well over 1 million pieces of correspondence delivered directly to NBC's offices across the 2 campaigns combined. University campuses became organizing grounds for petition drives. People physically gathered outside the network's broadcasting facilities and marched. All of this happened without the internet, without social media, without any of the digital tools that would today make such a campaign trivially easy to coordinate. It happened through sheer human will, through telephone trees and handwritten envelopes and people showing up in person. It worked both times. NBC reversed its cancellation decision and commissioned a 3rd season, going so far as to make the announcement publicly at a fan convention, an acknowledgement, without quite using the words, that the audience had won. The third season, underfunded and shuffled into a damaging late-night Friday timeslot, was the weakest the show produced, and the cancellation that followed it in 1969 was real and final. But that third season gave the show something absolutely essential: the episode count that qualified it for syndication. And syndication, as it turned out, was where everything actually began. The USS Enterprise, registry number NCC 1701, is among the most immediately recognizable fictional vessels ever put on screen. Its silhouette has been reproduced on every imaginable surface for nearly 6 decades, and it occupies a place in the visual iconography of popular culture that very few designed objects of any kind have managed to achieve. The original filming model, the 11-foot physical construction that appeared in the show itself, was a piece of genuine craftsmanship. It was also, in one very specific and rather poetic respect, entirely unfinished. The model's visible surfaces, the upper hull, the twin warp nacelles, the broad circular saucer section, were detailed and painted with real care and considerable skill. The underside was something else. Bare in places, rough in others, unpainted across significant sections of its surface, left in a state of incompletion that nobody involved in the production felt any particular pressure to address. The reasoning was straightforward. Every camera angle used in filming was composed either from above or from the side. The underside was never going to be visible. There was no budget available to finish surfaces that the audience would never have cause to examine, and so the surfaces remained unfinished. The model today is on permanent display at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum in Washington. If you were somehow able to turn it over and look at it from below, you would find yourself looking at the rough, unpainted underside of one of the most celebrated vehicles in the entire history of narrative. There is something almost vertiginously disorienting about this particular fact, because it feels so completely impossible that most people, on first hearing it, assume it must be wrong. "Beam me up, Scotty" is not merely a famous phrase. It is one of the most ubiquitous pieces of cultural shorthand in the English-speaking world. It has appeared on clothing and car bumpers and seasonal cards for the better part of 50 years. When James Doohan, the Canadian actor who gave Scotty his voice and his warmth, passed away, astronauts on the International Space Station invoked the phrase in tribute. It is, by any reasonable measure, the thing that Star Trek is most broadly known to have said. It does not appear in the original series. Not once, in any episode. What actually exists in the episodes is a cluster of close variations. "Beam us up, Scotty." "Scotty, beam me up." "Enterprise, beam me up," that orbit the famous combination of words without ever quite landing on it. The specific sequence that became culturally definitive was never actually spoken by anyone in the program that supposedly produced it. This is not, as it turns out, a phenomenon unique to Star Trek. "Play it again, Sam," does not exist in Casablanca. The phrase, "elementary, my dear Watson," appears nowhere in Arthur Conan Doyle's original fiction. Darth Vader's famous line is not "Luke, I am your father." It is "No, I am your father," which is subtly but meaningfully different in context. What the Star Trek example illustrates with particular clarity is the extent to which the cultural life of a piece of art can diverge entirely from its actual content, and how, in the end, the version of a thing that lives in collective memory can become more powerful and more real than the thing itself. The universe of Star Trek was supposed to be teeming with civilizations, worlds upon worlds of beings who dressed differently, organized themselves differently, and expressed their cultures through visual codes that felt genuinely distant from anything recognizably human. The wardrobe team responsible for bringing all of these alien peoples to life did their work with flair and ingenuity. They also did it, to a very considerable degree, by walking into the costume archives of the studio and helping themselves to whatever was already there. Hollywood's major studios in the 1960s maintained warehouses of extraordinary scope, decades of accumulated costumes from every genre of film and television production imaginable, stored and catalogued and theoretically available for reuse. Star Trek's costume department understood this resource and used it aggressively. The transformation principle was simple. Take something familiar from another context, recolor it, add new accessories, position it in a science fiction frame, and let the audience's willingness to suspend disbelief do the rest. Roman ceremonial robes became the formal dress of alien dignitaries. Frontier saloon wear from old Western productions became the everyday clothing of beings from distant star systems. Suits from cheap science fiction B-movies got new paint and new insignia and reappeared as something interstellar. Occasionally an attentive viewer would experience a faint flicker of recognition. A fabric, a cut, a silhouette that seemed to belong somewhere else, but the context shift was usually disorienting enough to suppress the connection before it fully formed. The illusion held. On a television screen viewed from across a living room, it only needed to hold for a few seconds at a time. The phaser is, within the internal logic of the Star Trek universe, the standard sidearm of Starfleet, a precision instrument capable of delivering calibrated energy outputs ranging from a brief and recoverable stun to complete molecular disintegration. As a piece of science fiction prop design, it has been endlessly referenced, imitated, and paid tribute to across nearly 6 decades of subsequent genre filmmaking. It was also, in its original form, built around what were essentially children's toys. The prop department did not begin its design process from scratch. It began by examining the collection of plastic ray gun props that already existed in the studio's inventory, items left over from previous productions, some of them novelty pieces, none of them originally intended to be taken particularly seriously. From this undistinguished foundation, the design team built upward. New coats of paint, additional surface detailing, components grafted on from other sources to create the impression of greater complexity and technological sophistication. The result, examined closely and in good light, had a quality that some viewers detected even at the time. A certain lightness of material, a slightly inexact proportion, the telltale smoothness of molded plastic rather than machined metal. Under the specific conditions of television production, however, with the lighting set and the sound design providing the sonic signature that made the weapon feel real, they read exactly as intended. The trajectory of what followed is one of the more striking examples of science fiction generating practical reality. The United States military has invested substantially over several decades in the development of directed energy weapons, systems that project focused beams of energy toward targets, which are, in their conceptual foundation, exactly what the phaser was imagined to be. The lineage from repainted prop to funded weapons research program is indirect and complicated, but it is real. Among all the episodes that Star Trek produced during its 3-season run, the one most reliably described as purely, uncomplicatedly enjoyable is almost certainly The Trouble with Tribbles, a 1967 hour of television in which the Enterprise is gradually overwhelmed by an adorable and disturbingly prolific species of small, round, continuously purring creatures. The episode is funny and warm and constructed with a lightness of touch that the show did not always achieve when it was reaching for it. It is also, from the perspective of the people who made it, the story of a production that spent a significant amount of its time fighting a problem nobody had anticipated. The tribble props were not complicated in their construction. Synthetic fur applied over foam cores, with small vibrating motors installed in some of them to produce the tactile sense of the purring that the creatures were supposed to generate. Under ordinary conditions, they would have been straightforward to handle. The conditions on a 1960s television production set, however, were not ordinary in the relevant respect. The studio lighting rigs required to illuminate the scenes generated substantial heat, and that heat acted on the synthetic fur in a way that nobody on the production had thought to anticipate. It caused the material to build up powerful static electric charges. The tribbles became generators. They adhered to actors' uniforms. They clung to furniture and to sections of the set that nobody wanted them clinging to. They attached themselves to camera equipment. Every crew member who handled them long enough experienced the small, sharp, unpleasant surprise of an unexpected discharge. The episode required hundreds of the props to be present and actively handled across multiple shooting days, which meant the problem did not resolve itself. It accumulated. Anyone who has spent meaningful time in the overlapping communities of science fiction enthusiasm, narrative theory, or internet-era genre discussion will be familiar with the concept of the red shirt, the unnamed, undeveloped crew member who materializes alongside the main characters at the beginning of an away mission and is reliably dead before the act break. The function of this character type within a story is structural, to demonstrate that genuine danger exists in a situation without requiring the narrative to sacrifice anyone the audience has a real investment in. The expendable character, the narrative placeholder, the walking signal that the stakes are serious. This is not an invention of Star Trek. What Star Trek did was give the concept a visual identity so clean and so memorable that it permanently attached to it. The show's uniform design assigned colors to departments: gold for command, blue for science and medicine, red for engineering and security. The personnel wearing red were, by the nature of their departmental assignments, the ones most likely to find themselves in physically hazardous situations. When those same personnel appeared as anonymous figures in away mission sequences, fan analysis conducted across the decades of the show's afterlife confirmed what viewers had intuitively absorbed during the original broadcasts, that the red uniformed background figures died at a rate that was statistically disproportionate to their numbers. The show itself never once acknowledged this pattern explicitly. No character ever observed it. It existed as a kind of silent visual grammar that the audience absorbed through accumulation, episode by episode, season by season, until it had become a cultural reflex. It subsequently escaped the bounds of science fiction entirely and established itself in business language, in military thinking, in academic discussions of narrative structure, and in the general vocabulary of anyone who has ever needed a shorthand for talking about who gets sacrificed first. Put the question to virtually any person with even a passing familiarity with the Star Trek franchise and they will tell you the same thing. The Klingon are the villains. The warrior culture, the confrontational honor code, the ridged foreheads and the aggressive posture. The Klingon have become so thoroughly identified with the idea of opposition to the Federation and its values that imagining Star Trek without them requires a genuine effort. In the original series, however, the Klingon were an afterthought compared to the alien adversaries who actually came first. The Romulans appeared before the Klingon did, introduced in an episode called Balance of Terror, that is still regularly cited as among the finest single hours the original series produced. They were secretive and calculating and possessed of their own form of honor, and the threat they represented felt less like brute antagonism and more like the complex, mutually mistrustful tension of two superpowers watching each other across a fortified border, which is, of course, precisely the analogy with Cold War geopolitics that the episode was drawing. The Klingon arrived subsequently as a more straightforwardly aggressive presence, one that served a different kind of anxiety about a different kind of threat, but they were never the dominant force in the original show's villainous landscape that the franchise's later decades would make them appear to have been. The elevation of the Klingon to their current position of cultural primacy happened primarily through Star Trek III and through The Next Generation, which built their mythology into something vast and enduring. The original show was working with a considerably more complicated moral and political landscape than its popular reputation suggests. Captain James T. Kirk's reputation within the Star Trek universe rests on a specific cluster of qualities: the willingness to make decisions in conditions of radical uncertainty, the refusal to accept outcomes that the available data suggests are inevitable, and the capacity to be right in exactly the moments when being right seems most impossible. These qualities are understood by any fan of the show as simply who Kirk is, the essence of the character rather than a constructed narrative choice. What is less commonly known is that they were constructed with considerable deliberateness, and that the mechanism of their construction was the ship's computer. The writers and producers made a documented and intentional decision to build Kirk's heroism in explicit counterpoint to what the computer said. The computer's function in this dynamic was to provide the rational calculation, the probability assessment, the statistical likelihood of success or failure, the logical extrapolation from available data to projected outcome. What it consistently produced was pessimism. High chances of failure, unacceptable projected casualties, no precedent for a successful resolution. And Kirk would listen to this and then he would do the thing anyway and he would be right. Every time. The argument embedded in this recurring structure was pointed and specific. A claim about the limits of calculation, about what human experience and moral judgment can access that pure data processing cannot, about why the irreducible quality of lived human decision-making matters even in a universe that can be partially quantified. In 1966, when the cultural encounter with computing technology was just beginning for most ordinary people, this was a statement that carried genuine weight. In 2026, when the question of how much authority to extend to algorithmic systems is among the most consequential policy questions in existence, it turns out to have been a statement that was well ahead of its time. Gene Roddenberry's ambitions for Star Trek extended well beyond the creation of an entertaining program about space exploration. He wanted to use the speculative distance that science fiction provides, the displacement into future centuries and alien worlds, as a mechanism for saying things about the present that could not be said directly without triggering the institutional defenses of the network system and the commercial pressures that sustained it. In the America of the late 1960s, with its civil rights confrontations and its Vietnam anguish and its Cold War anxieties and its generational fractures, those institutional defenses were operating at full sensitivity. Anything that resembled a direct engagement with any of these live wires risked being cut from the broadcast or, worse, threatening the show's continued existence entirely. The solution Roddenberry and his writing team developed was to dress every argument in a costume that made it technically about something else. The episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, depicts a humanoid species whose population is divided between those whose faces are black on the left side and white on the right, and those whose configuration runs in the opposite direction. These two groups have prosecuted a war of mutual extermination against each other across centuries, each side convinced with absolute certainty that their particular arrangement of pigmentation represents superiority. The allegory required no translation. Other episodes engaged with the economics of warfare, with the corruptions that accumulate around political power, with the terrifying momentum of mob behavior, with the uses and abuses of organized religion. All of it processed through alien civilizations and future centuries, which proved, as Roddenberry had calculated, considerably harder for the censors to object to than direct treatment would have been. The science fiction frame was not merely aesthetic decoration. It was the mechanism that made the content possible. Not every story from behind the scenes of Star Trek involves creative courage or social significance or bitter institutional struggle. Some of them are simply strange and delightful and slightly inexplicable, and this is one of those. At some point during the show's production run, the precise circumstances remain somewhat unclear. Somebody decided that the cast of Star Trek should go into a recording studio together and make a Christmas album. Not a tasteful, carefully produced seasonal offering designed to capitalize gracefully on their celebrity. A full commitment to the particular kind of enthusiastic absurdity that results when a group of actors who are famous for something completely unrelated to music are handed microphones and festive material and pointed at a recording desk. William Shatner approached the assignment with the same total commitment he brought to everything, delivering a version of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that occupied some impossible territory between a lullaby and a dramatic monologue, soothing and bewildering in roughly equal measure. Leonard Nimoy, who could perhaps have been expected to deliver something dry and ironic, instead offered a spoken-word piece called Once Upon a Star, in a tone of such profound earnestness that it functioned as an accidental comedy of cosmic proportions. Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, and the rest of the ensemble threw themselves into their contributions with an enthusiasm that the word "merry" does not fully capture. The album was never intended as a significant commercial release. It was essentially a promotional curiosity, produced for a specific and limited context. It then disappeared almost completely. For years it circulated only in bootleg form, passed between collectors who treated it as an artifact of extraordinary rarity. Eventually official releases followed, and what had been a bizarre footnote became a cult object with a dedicated and genuinely appreciative following. Everything that Star Trek put on screen, the model spacecraft, the alien makeups, the planetary environments, the special effects sequences, the elaborate bridge set with all of its flashing lights and its complicated-looking controls, was produced with a financial allocation that any contemporary production designer would find not merely inadequate but essentially insulting. The budget that the show operated on across its 3-season run required a level of creative ingenuity from everyone involved that went so far beyond ordinary professional resourcefulness that it began to function as a kind of institutional culture in its own right. The same corridor set appeared on alien spacecraft inside space stations, and within the corridors of Starfleet facilities across dozens of episodes, differentiated from one appearance to the next by minor modifications in lighting and set dressing. Crew members from other departments were regularly pulled in, put into costume, and placed in the background of scenes that needed more bodies than the actual extras budget could supply. Visual effects that in contemporary production would require teams of specialists and significant post-production budgets were achieved through hand-built physical models, painted backdrop photography, and optical effects assembled in post-production at a cost that represented a tiny fraction of what modern equivalents would require. The ingenuity that necessity produced was not without its limits, And those limits became increasingly visible as the third season progressed and the financial constraints tightened further. Scripts that called for visual ambition were realized as conversations between people standing in rooms, because the money to realize what the page described was simply not there. And yet the ideas survived the impoverishment of their presentation, which says something rather important about where the actual value in Star Trek had always resided. Here, finally, is the fact that contains within it the whole arc of the Star Trek story. The one that renders everything that came before it in a different light and explains why a program that failed by every conventional measure of its own era eventually became one of the most enduring entertainment franchises in human history. During the 3 seasons that Star Trek aired on NBC, it was not a hit. It was not even close to a hit by the standards of the time. The ratings it produced were mediocre throughout. The network's support for it was grudging and conditional, and frequently threatened outright withdrawal. It was cancelled in 1969 with viewing numbers that, in the context of 1960s network television, represented genuine commercial failure. By any reasonable application of the metrics that the industry used to measure its own success, Star Trek had not succeeded. Then it entered syndication. Local television stations across the United States began picking up the episodes and airing them in afternoon and evening rerun slots. And something started to happen that nobody in the network television system had anticipated or planned for. A generation of viewers who had been too young to watch the show during its original broadcast found it in these rerun slots, and experienced it without the institutional indifference that had surrounded its first airing. College students in particular took to it with an intensity and an intellectual seriousness that the show's content actually warranted, and that the mainstream audience had never quite extended to it the first time around. Fan conventions began to appear. The actors found themselves, for the first time, fully understanding what they had spent 3 years making. The correspondence multiplied. The merchandise market expanded. The cultural weight accumulated through syndication, slowly at first and then with increasing momentum, until by the middle of the 1970s it was simply undeniable. Star Trek was a phenomenon, and it was one that had grown directly and paradoxically out of the silence and the indifference and the cancellation that had once seemed to be the end of the story. The first feature film followed in 1979. Further films came after that. Star Trek: The Next Generation launched in 1987 and achieved the commercial success that had always eluded the original, becoming a massive hit in its own right and establishing beyond any remaining doubt that the franchise had a future. Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, Discovery, Strange New Worlds, the production of new Star Trek content has continued, in one form or another, for nearly 60 years since the September evening in 1966 when the whole thing began with mediocre ratings and an embarrassingly small budget. The legacy that accumulated across all of those decades is not purely cultural. It is, in a measurable and documented sense, technological. The mobile phone's flip design was consciously influenced by the communicator that Kirk pulled from his belt. The PDD, the personal access display device that characters in the show use to read data and transmit information, is a direct conceptual ancestor of the tablet computer. Automatic sliding doors, wireless in-ear communication devices, handheld medical scanning instruments. All of these things were imagined in visual and functional detail on Star Trek before they existed in reality, and the engineers and scientists who built the real versions have, in numerous documented cases, cited the show as part of the imaginative context in which they grew up and from which their ambitions emerged. Roddenberry's original pitch document described the show as Wagon Train to the Stars, a frontier western transposed into space, with the Enterprise as the wagon train and the galaxy as the unexplored territory. What the show actually became, over the full course of its influence, was something considerably more durable than any frontier adventure. A set of values given narrative form and transmitted across generations. The conviction that a community is made stronger by the differences of its members, rather than diminished by them. The proposition that curiosity, pursued with courage, is itself a form of virtue. The belief that the future is a place worth moving toward, worth working for, worth imagining in detail because the act of imagining it in detail is part of how it gets built. Live long and prosper. If you stayed with this until the end, you know what to do. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which of these 20 facts genuinely surprised you. We will see you in the next one.